The Terminal Echo. A psychological horror story. The first time it happened, Elias Vance spilled his coffee. It wasn't a prophetic, grand event, it was mundane. He was standing in the kitchen of the National Records Archive, where he spent his life among the quiet ghosts of paper and ink, waiting for the industrial drip machine to finish its dreary work. He was wearing his gray cardigan, the one with the slight tear near the cuff, and he was listening to the muffled bass thudding from the maintenance room downstairs, a sound that only occurred every Tuesday morning. He reached for the ceramic mug labeled, "Property of the Archives," and as his fingers brushed the hot rim, the mug tilted, the black liquid slopping over the side. He swore under his breath, stepping back. Then, the peculiar chill arrived. I have done this before. Not almost done this. Not imagined doing this. He had lived this exact sequence. The muted bass, the heat of the rim, the precise angle of the tilt, the sharp, momentary sting of the coffee on his knuckles. He could recall the taste of ash and regret in his mouth from the last time, a sensation that had not yet occurred but was already etched into his memory. He cleaned the spill, threw out the saturated paper towel, and dismissed it. Classic déjà vu, a wiring anomaly in the brain, a split-second delay between the eyes and the memory centers. Nothing supernatural. Until the second time. It was later that week. Elias was on the phone with his sister, Sarah, discussing their mother's upcoming surgery. The conversation was strained, punctuated by long, anxious silences. And she said the recovery time would be 4 to 6 weeks, I think. Sarah asked, her voice brittle. Elias leaned against the steel bookshelf, the metal cool beneath his elbow. Yes, he confirmed. But don't worry. She'll be fine. She's tough, remember. As he said the words, the same electrical shock hit him, colder and more potent this time. The phrase, "she's tough, remember," was a perfectly remembered echo. But it was more than the words. He remembered the faint squeak of the book cart rolling past the end of the aisle exactly 3 seconds before he spoke, and the way the fluorescent light had flickered above him immediately after. He remembered the hollow, helpless feeling in his chest that accompanied the memory of saying it, a feeling that only truly arrived when he said it now. He choked on the next syllable. Sarah paused. Elias. Are you okay? He gripped the phone, sweat slicking his palm. Yes, fine. Just a bad connection. The feeling wasn't pleasant familiarity. It was profound, sickening recognition, like being forced to watch a film you already knew was a tragedy. The moments, now, began to stack. The next Monday, he walked to work. He rounded the corner of Maple Street, and as he approached the aging oak tree near the park entrance, the déjà vu struck, a deep-sea pressure that compressed his skull. He had walked this path before. He knew that the silver minivan parked 20 feet ahead would honk exactly twice. He knew that the teenage girl in the red headphones on the opposite sidewalk would stop to adjust her backpack strap, and he knew that, as she did so, she would accidentally drop a single, crumpled $5 bill. Elias stopped dead. He could not watch this. He wanted to scream at the minivan driver, push the girl out of the way, anything to break the loop. But the compulsion, the profound psychological knowledge of the correct action, was absolute. He was a passenger in his own body, forced to rerun a pre-recorded sequence. The silver minivan honked. Honk. Honk. The girl stopped, fumbled with her strap, and the crumpled $5 bill drifted to the pavement. Elias felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the morning air. This wasn't a glitch in the matrix, it was a cage. He wasn't seeing the future. He was only seeing the past, but the past was also his present. He was trapped in a predetermined timeline, and the horrific part was the knowledge that he had already failed to change it. Every thought, every desperate attempt to deviate, was part of the original, remembered sequence. Elias started keeping meticulous records. In a small, black, leather-bound journal, he documented every echo, as he termed the déjà vu events, with timestamps, sensory details, and, most importantly, the duration of the precognition. Echo 1, coffee spill, duration, 5 seconds. Trivial. Echo 2, Sarah's call, duration, 15 seconds. Emotional context, anxiety, noted. Echo 3, Maple Street, duration, 30 seconds. Involved multiple external, random variables. Crucially, I tried to stop, but my feet stalled. The outcome was fixed. The duration was accelerating. He was gaining more time within the echo. One evening, he was alone in the archive basement, surrounded by stacks of centuries-old land deeds. The archive was cavernous, smelling of dust and dried glue, and entirely silent save for the air conditioning hum. The air conditioning abruptly cut out. Silence. The déjà vu slammed into him like a physical blow, worse than any before. He was standing in the exact position he remembered, leaning against a steel shelf unit. The unit was unstable. In the memory, he knew he had tried to move, had tried to shove the heavy cart next to him away from the leaning shelving, but he was too late. The metal groaned. Snap. In the echo memory, a crucial supporting bracket on the shelf unit sheared off. He vividly remembered the sound. It wasn't just a sound. It was a specific, metallic shriek. Elias's actual body froze. His mind screamed. Move. He knew, with the sickening certainty of a rerun, that the shelf would collapse in exactly 2.5 seconds, burying him under hundreds of pounds of 18th century documents. This time, the echo lasted 45 seconds. 45 agonizing seconds where he experienced the collapse, the impact, the crushing weight across his chest, the dust blinding him, and the final, wheezing realization that he was paralyzed and alone. He lived the whole 45 seconds of the accident, complete with the ringing in his ears and the taste of blood. The déjà vu ended. Elias was still standing, untouched, the air conditioner still silent. He had 45 seconds of grace before the real event began. He lurched forward, scrambling away from the shelf. He didn't dare push the cart. He just ran, diving behind a solid concrete pillar. Snap. The bracket sheared. The massive steel shelf unit twisted, groaned, and collapsed into the aisle, raining dust and history onto the spot where he had been standing. Elias stayed behind the pillar, hyperventilating, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He hadn't stopped the event, but he had survived it. The timeline hadn't been changed, only his position within it had shifted. He was running a pre-recorded track, but now, he had the advantage of the replay button. He was living his life in preemptive echoes, a fraction of time ahead of the reality. The psychological toll was devastating. Elias could no longer trust his present reality, knowing it was always an echo of a future he had already seen and, usually, endured. The world had become a stuttering, predictable nightmare. He lived every interaction twice. Once in the silent, terrifying replay, and once in the real, unavoidable performance. The terror wasn't the violence he sometimes witnessed, but the lack of free will. His fate was sealed the first time the echo ran. The length of the echo continued to grow exponentially. From seconds to minutes. Then, one Tuesday morning, it changed everything. Elias woke up in his bed. The clock read 6:30 a.m. Sunlight, filtered through the cheap blinds, striped the beige carpet. The déjà vu hit him. It wasn't a sudden jolt. It was a slow, terrifying immersion. He was suddenly no longer in his body, but hovering just behind his own eyes, watching the playback of the final, defining moments of his life. He saw himself shave, eat burnt toast, tie his shoes with the familiar double knot. He experienced the exact, irritating sound of his neighbor's dog barking as he locked his front door. The echo played out his entire day. He saw himself arrive at the archive, exchange pleasantries with the security guard, precisely 3 words. Morning, rainy again. And spend the morning sorting the D-section manuscripts. He knew exactly which paper cut he would receive at 10:17 a.m., index finger, left hand, near the nail. He saw himself eat a predictable lunch of a turkey sandwich, and at 3:45 p.m., he saw the new archivist, Mr. Kellen, approach his desk. In the echo, Kellen looked pale, his eyes wide with a manic fear Elias had never seen before. Vance, Kellen had whispered, looking over his shoulder, I saw it. I saw the fracture. It's not déjà vu. We're moving parallel. And it's accelerating. You have to stop looking at the records. They're feeding it. Elias, in the memory, had dismissed Kellen as stressed. Kellen had then walked away, vanishing into the maze of shelves. The total duration of this echo was nearly 12 hours of fully realized memory. When the echo ended, Elias sat bolt upright in bed, drenched in cold sweat. It was still 6:30 a.m. He had just lived his entire day. The horror was no longer that he was running a loop, but that the loop was getting longer, the echo catching up to the main timeline. He was living his life twice, with a full day offset, and he knew Kellen was going to approach him. He knew the paper cut was inevitable. He had to find Kellen before 3:45 p.m. and hear what he had to say, and perhaps, more importantly, try to save the man from whatever fear had gripped him in the echo. Elias rushed the morning. He skipped the burnt toast, opting for an apple. He tied his shoes with a single, hasty knot. He tried to break the mundane pattern, but it felt hollow. He was only performing variations on the same script. He arrived at the archive. The security guard, old Mr. Finch, looked up. Morning. Rainy again, Mr. Finch mumbled. The déjà vu, despite his attempts to alter the lead up, was perfect. At 10:17 a.m., he was careful. He handled the D-section papers with extreme caution, wearing thin cotton gloves. At precisely 10:17 a.m., he reached for a fragile 1792 ledger. The paper was sharp, like obsidian. It slid past the protective glove, slicing his index finger near the nail. The pain was sharp and familiar. The paper cut was fixed. The time was fixed. He found Mr. Kellen in the break room at 1 p.m. Kellen was a quiet man, timid and methodical, not the wild-eyed lunatic Elias had witnessed in his echo memory. Elias approached him, his voice low. Mr. Kellen, I need to talk to you about déjà vu. Kellen blinked, startled. Déjà vu. I'm afraid I don't follow, Vance. Just listen. At 3:45 this afternoon, you're going to come to my desk. You're going to talk about a fracture, and the records, feeding it. You need to tell me now. What did you see? Kellen backed away, his face twisting into confusion and slight fear. Mr. Vance, I think you need to take a break. I haven't even finished cataloging the C-section yet. I have no plans to speak to you about anything. Elias realized the true horror. Kellen hadn't yet experienced the echo that would make him manic. Elias was living Kellen's future, but Kellen was still living his own present. Elias's time frame was ahead. He tried desperately to warn the man, to explain the nature of the accelerating loops, but Kellen simply excused himself, leaving Elias alone, feeling like a prophet screaming at a deaf world. Elias waited, dread pooling in his gut. He knew the exact moment was coming. He tried to leave the desk, but his legs felt heavy, trapped by the magnetic force of the impending echo. 3:44 p.m. He sat at his desk, watching the clock tick. 3:45 p.m. The footsteps approached. Mr. Kellen appeared, his face ghastly pale, exactly as Elias had seen him in the echo. His eyes were wide with a frantic, unhinged fear. "Vance," Kellen whispered, glancing frantically over his shoulder at the silent, empty aisles. "I saw it. I saw the fracture. It's not déjà vu. We're moving parallel. And it's accelerating. You have to stop looking at the records. They're feeding it." He delivered the lines perfectly, word for word. He was not talking to Elias. He was rerunning his own terrified script. Elias leaned forward. "I know, Kellen. I already heard this. I lived this 12 hours ago. Tell me about the fracture, what records?" But Kellen was already pulling away, retreating into the aisle, eyes fixed on an unseen terror. "It's too late. The runtime is almost over." He vanished. Elias immediately jumped up and followed, but Kellen was gone. The archive was endless, swallowing people whole. Kellen had experienced the echo, realized the horror, and then, finding no help, was swallowed by the inevitability of his own flight. Elias felt the next one coming like an oncoming train. The pressure built not in his head, but in his chest, a deep, crushing sorrow. He raced home, frantic to document, to prepare, to simply wait for the next, inevitable replay. He opened his apartment door, the wood groaning. The déjà vu started. This echo was different. It wasn't a day, or a week. It was a sensory deluge, overwhelming his consciousness with a flow of fragmented, yet perfectly ordered memories that spanned weeks, maybe months. He saw holidays pass, a forgotten Christmas, a lonely birthday. He saw the slow deterioration of his health, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his paranoia eventually drove Sarah away. He saw himself sitting in his small apartment, the windows taped up with newspaper, surrounded by his black notebooks, consumed by the fracture theory. The fracture, he came to understand in the echo, wasn't a break in time. It was a compression. Time wasn't looping. It was being folded over, forcing the events to occur closer and closer together. His consciousness, for some inexplicable reason, was locked onto the earlier layer of the fold, granting him precognition only to make him a captive of fate. The déjà vu was the overlap of the layers. He experienced a profound, soul-crushing moment of realization in the echo. He would never achieve free will again. His entire remaining life was a recorded play, and he was the actor, forced to hit his marks. He lived through the slow decay of his sanity in the echo, a timeline where he tried, and failed, repeatedly, to deviate. He knew the specific flavor of the whiskey he would drink 3 months from now, the precise article he would write in his journal next autumn, and the cold despair that would settle over him next spring. The full duration of this terrifying, crushing echo was approximately 9 months. When the memory stream ended, Elias collapsed against his door. It was still the same evening. He had 9 months of foreknowledge. 9 months of a predetermined, miserable, isolating future that he was now forced to perform. The horror was no longer imminent death. It was the slow, drawn-out death of his soul. Elias tried to fight it. He used his 9 months of foreknowledge to do the opposite of what he remembered. In the echo, he had quit his job. So, he went back to the archive. In the echo, he had cut off Sarah. So, he called her every day. In the echo, he had sold his car. So, he took a road trip. But the harder he fought the script, the more perfectly he realized his actions were already part of the original script. He remembered selling the car, but he also remembered the profound joy he felt taking the road trip, joy that he had dismissed in the memory as a brief flicker of delusion before returning to his archives and his paranoia. The road trip was part of the pre-scripted 9 months. He hadn't changed anything. He was merely fulfilling the role he had desperately tried to avoid in the memory. He realized the fracture Kellen had mentioned must be the archive itself. All that static, dense, historical data, paper, bound, dated, it was an anchor. It was holding his consciousness to an earlier, slower layer of time, while the rest of the world moved forward, accelerating the overlap. The archive wasn't the cause, but the mechanism. One day, 8 months into his agonizing double life, he went back to the section of the collapse. The steel shelf was gone, but the air still felt cold. He found the old 18th century ledger that had sliced his finger. Inside the front cover, tucked into the spine, was a single, folded piece of paper. It was Kellen's handwriting. "Vance, I knew you would find this. I lived the collapse. Twice. You survived it because you were already living the echo. You and I are the only ones on the outer layer. The rest of the world is on the next layer, catching up fast. The fracture is the moment the loops merge. The point where the echo becomes the reality and there is no more precognition, only the ending. I saw my end. I saw my final echo run for 3 days. It was a simple, mundane, isolated death in an empty library in another city. I tried to go to the city and warn myself, but I realized, to be there to warn him, I had to fulfill the echo that brought me there. I couldn't escape the loop because my escape was part of the loop. I'm sorry. The next one is coming soon. The terminal echo. Don't look at it. Don't live it. If you see it, you must accept it. To fight is to fulfill." Kellen hadn't run away. He had simply gone to his predetermined end. The paper crumbled in Elias's hand. He was 8 months into a 9-month loop. The final, terminal, echo was next. The terminal echo arrived exactly 32 days later. Elias was sitting at his kitchen table, drinking his morning coffee, unburnt toast, single knotted shoes, the whole script. It wasn't a crushing force this time. It was a smooth, silent cessation of reality. He was suddenly no longer in his body, but hovering just behind his own eyes, watching the playback of the final, defining moments of his life. The duration was infinite. This wasn't an echo of a moment or a day. It was the echo of the end of the timeline. The setting was familiar, yet new. He was standing on a cobblestone street in a historic district he'd never visited before, clutching the black notebook. It was dusk. The air smelled of wet stone and gasoline. He felt the exhaustion of 9 months of fighting the script, and the deep, resigned acceptance Kellen had mentioned. In the echo, he knew he was here for one purpose: to find the anchor point, the mechanism that caused the temporal folding. He knew, with absolute certainty, that it was in the clock tower at the end of the street. He watched himself walk, his body moving like a wind-up toy, pre-programmed. He felt the weight of his final, inevitable thoughts. It wasn't a bad life. Just short. And now, twice lived. He climbed the narrow, dizzying spiral staircase inside the old clock tower. The stone was cold, slick with moss. Upstairs, a vast room housed the intricate clockwork, massive brass gears turning slowly, silently. In the center of the room, on a small wooden table, was an open book. It was a perfect, pristine copy of his own black journal. Elias, the man in the echo, reached out and touched the page. The final entry was not yet written, but the pen was lying ready next to the phrase, "The fracture is the loop. The loop is." As he touched the book, he heard a sound. Not a snap, not a groan, but a slow, tearing sound, like wet paper being ripped. A man stepped out of the shadows. Tall, nondescript, wearing a gray cardigan with a tear near the cuff. It was the Elias of a previous, slower loop, one who had reached this point earlier, and had become a remnant. He was pale, skeletal, yet smiling with infinite sadness. "Welcome to the end, Vance," the remnant whispered. "The echo ends here. You tried to change it, but your efforts were just the fuel. The loop is the engine. Remnant Elias lunged, not to kill, but to absorb. Elias, trapped behind his own eyes in the echo, watched his body struggle, grappling with the wraith of his future self. He watched as Remnant Elias forced the pen into his hand, forcing him to write the final words. ... The loop is me. As the words were scrawled, the massive brass clock gears ground to a halt. The temporal folding snapped shut. The echo was over. Elias was back in his kitchen chair, the taste of burnt toast and a phantom scent of wet stone in his mouth. He was terrified, shaking. It was 7:05 a.m. The full realization sank in. He had just relived his death, and the event was now playing out in real time, 7:05 a.m. to his final breath. He was 32 days into a pre-run that had already been executed. He had one last chance. Kellen's note. Don't look at it. Don't live it. If you see it, you must accept it. If he tried to fight, he would only fulfill the script that led him to the clock tower, the journal, and the encounter with his remnant self. He stood up, his body already moving towards the door. The compulsion was overwhelming, the magnetic pull of the script irresistible. He saw his hand reach for the car keys. He looked down at his clothes. He was wearing the very same gray cardigan with the torn cuff that he had worn for the coffee spill, the first echo. It was the beginning, and the end. He didn't fight the key grab, or the drive to the old historic district. He didn't fight the exhaustion or the pull toward the clock tower. He walked up to the base of the tower and looked up at the stone, the air smelling of wet stone and gasoline, just as he remembered. He closed his eyes. Acceptance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the black journal. Instead of taking it up the stairs, he used his last fragment of free will, a choice he hadn't foreseen in the terminal echo, and threw it, violently, into a muddy puddle. Then, he climbed the stairs, his body moving without thought, fulfilling the rote movements of the predetermined path. He reached the clock room. The brass gears were silent, still. The wooden table stood in the center. But the book was not there. Only a blank piece of paper. The final word, me, had not been written yet. He saw the shadow detach from the wall. The tall, gaunt figure in the gray cardigan emerged. Remnant Elias. Remnant Elias stopped, his empty eyes fixed not on Elias's body, but on his muddy, empty hands. There was no journal. The key component of the trap, the writing of the final word, was disrupted. The remnant's face twisted from sad resignation into utter confusion. But the loop requires the writing. Elias, the primary self, was exhausted but free. He hadn't fought the path, only the purpose. The loop is broken, Kellen, Elias whispered, realizing the remnant was just a form of Kellen's earlier warning. I didn't bring the anchor. The remnant screamed, a sound of tearing silk, not human. It lunged, not to absorb, but to kill. But without the book, without the completed circuit, the remnant was unstable. As it crossed the center of the room, the figure began to shimmer, the fabric of the gray cardigan dissolving into dust. Elias stood firm, not moving, accepting the end of the script. The remnant hit him, but it was just air, a final, cold puff of temporal wind. It disintegrated entirely, vanishing into the silent clockwork. Elias leaned against the stone railing, gasping. He was alone. The clock gears remained silent. He had lived his end, but he had escaped the inevitability of the written end. He walked back down the stairs, out into the setting sun. The street was quiet. He didn't know what his future held, but for the first time in what felt like 2 lifetimes, he knew it was his. He didn't know if the temporal folds would continue, or if the echo would ever return, but as he drove away from the silent clock tower, he was no longer a puppet, and the horror of absolute predetermination was finally broken. He was free to spill his coffee tomorrow, or not, and the world would not require him to clean it up perfectly. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.